I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views.
Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Independent media matters, and your support makes it possible. If Parallax Views has challenged your thinking, exposed you to new ideas, or simply kept you company on your commute, now's the time to help sustain it. Listen, share, and if you can, support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. If you want, you can also make a one-time donation by contacting me at parallaxviewspod@protonmail.com. I can give you a link to my PayPal page if you contact me that way. Let's show what listener-supported media can do. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners! Sorry for my absence the past week. I know it's only been a week since the last episode, but usually in the past I've put out 2, 3, 4 episodes a week. I've slowed down a little bit just because listeners have said that it's hard to keep up, but also because I've had some health issues. I had an issue with my shoulder recently, so I was out of commission for a few days fixing that. In any case, I'm glad to be back, and on this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from longtime tech and science journalist Jacob Ward. He formerly worked at NBC News. He hosts The Rip Current on YouTube, and he has a book that I think you'll find highly intriguing that forms the basis of our discussion today, entitled The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. That book came out in 2022, and it is now more relevant than ever. We're going to be getting into the problems of AI and the psychological impact it has had on us and on our institutions. All that and more on this edition of the program. Before we begin the conversation, I'd like to remind you that this show is, for the most part, listener funded, outside of my one sponsor, the mighty Mike Swanson of Wall Street Window. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. Also, check out my sponsor, Mike Swanson's newsletter, wallstreetwindow.com, where you can get the best trading and financial news. I've had listeners make a return on investment thanks to Mike's trading tips. If you sign up now, you can also get his free ebook, The Twofold Formula, the single best trading pattern I have ever used. Check it out at wallstreetwindow.com. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation with Jacob Ward. Welcome to Parallax Views. A guest that I'm very happy to be speaking with. Jacob Ward is an American science and technology journalist with 20 plus years experience covering the social and human consequences of technology. He's also the author of the book, The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices, and host of the show, The Rip Current, which you can find on YouTube. And he does some work with NBC News. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Did I miss anything there in my
No,
short
that was
bio?
very, very thoughtful that you to list as many of those experiences as you did. Yeah.
So I guess where I want to begin is let's talk about your journey to covering these issues related to AI, because I believe you started out as a magazine editor, science journalist, TV correspondent, looking at behavioral science, and now you're looking at AI. How did that come to be?
Well, I was, as you mentioned, a magazine editor. So my last job in publishing was I was the editor-in-chief of Popular Science magazine. And at that time, we were sort of in a world where there was the beginnings of what one could have called AI. There were people operating in that world. We wrote, for instance, a profile of Jan LeCun, who has just announced that he's leaving Meta. He was the head of basically the head of AI. He was kind of the grandfather of AI inside Meta. And at that time, This was like 2012, I want to say. This is a guy who's like he's working out of a university appointment. He's getting like some military money to try and make drones fly in places they've never really been able to be before. And so there was the beginnings of the sense that a pattern recognition technology was sort of coming online, and you could sort of sense that. So I understood it from a kind of zeros and ones perspective, and what I fundamentally understood was just how far we were from a workable version of true kind of, AI processing. And then I did time as a correspondent at Al Jazeera, and then had a time there of doing a documentary series called Hacking Your Mind, which I did for PBS. And that was a real like crash course for me in behavioral science, like the last century essentially of behavioral science. And the big lesson of that, the headline of that show, is that we are beholden to a very ancient and very powerful kind of instinctive circuitry that makes most of our decisions for us in this very unconscious way, while giving us the illusion that we are in charge of our own choices, that we're doing it ourselves. And at the same time that I was meeting and interviewing all these top experts around the world in that field of study, I was also becoming more and more acquainted with what was getting to be a much more sophisticated form of AI, where you had, there was at the time, there was kind of early versions of what was called human reinforcement learning and machine learning and neural networks. But I started to recognize the beginnings of what people were working on in what were called transformers. Transformer models were these models that currently make it possible for you to pour the internet's writing into a funnel, and out of the bottom you get a bunch of good guesses about what should come next in a sentence. And that transformer model revolution, combined with what I'd been learning about, how basically programmable human beings are in a way, just started to get me worried, especially as I began to bump into more and more and more companies that were clearly hoping to analyze and then predict and maybe even shape people's behavior. I just started to kind of panic. And I'm not typically the kind of guy who's like, you got to hear my thoughts, everybody's got to hear my ideas. But I just hadn't heard anybody talking about AI from a human behavior perspective, only from a kind of like, is it a Terminator worry perspective, or from a economic perspective. But nobody was talking about what is this going to do to us as a society and as sort of psychologically. And that's what I chose to focus on. So that was my journey.
Let's talk more about that aspect of how this is going to affect us psychologically, because I think people are more drawn, unfortunately, to talking about, is this going to be Skynet from Terminator, or,
I know, right?
the paperclip hypothesis? But I'm actually where you're at, where I'm more interested in, well, what is this going to do with regards to how we make decisions? So
Right.
can you talk about the basics of that and the thesis of your book, really?
Yeah. So the thesis of the book is that if you build a commercial, an AI system and you commercialize it, you run the risk of doing to our fundamental cognitive abilities and social abilities what Google Maps has done to our sense of direction, basically, right? I can't find my way from A to B without Google Maps these days, and I think that's true for a lot of people. There are even all of these anecdotes in which people, drive off the end of a pier because they follow the directions to the wrong place, right? We are, as a society, but more specifically as a species, we are built to, wherever we possibly can, outsource our decision making. It's like one of the top sort of learnings of the last 100 years of behavioral science is like we love to offload our choices. And we very often will offload them to our environment, right? So like I'm a former drinker. I don't drink alcohol anymore. I had to decide that that was just not right for me. And one of the things that I do to keep myself on track is I stay away from the kinds of environments that used to involve drinking. I don't go into bars anymore, because what the behavioral scientists will tell you is your brain outsources the choice about drinking to the cues it gets from its environment. When you smell the bar and are sitting there, I can, just in talking to you, I can imagine physically what it is to be at that smooth, rounded edge of the bar, and the dark wood paneling and all that stuff. And it absolutely triggers in me this through line to the clink of ice in the glass and the antiseptic sting of the first drink and all that stuff. It's just, it's a choreography that your brain just follows once it is triggered by its surroundings.
What
And
another, not to
yeah,
interrupt
go
you,
ahead.
but what
Please go
another
on.
example of maybe how the environment affects our decision making. Sometimes so I'm big into like movies, right? And sometimes I'll buy my movies on Amazon because I like having the physical discs. If I
Hmm.
buy a bunch of Criterion collection movies, it'll start suggesting more Criterion collections. So
Sure.
that's sort of another like example of offloading that relates to me. But I can see I'm just trying to give examples to help people understand better.
Yeah, I mean, another example of this from the pre-AI world is, the algorithmic recommendations that the music engines all provide these days. So, like, I used to be the kind of nerd who would, who could tell you everything about every band, and I'd follow them around, and I knew what was going on. Right now, I listen to the Discover Weekly that Spotify gives me. And when people say, "What do you listen to these days?" I can tell them more like the genre than I can the band names, because I'm just taking passively what is handed to me algorithmically there, right? And it is done to my music taste, what Google Maps has done to my sense of direction. And so I think anybody who is interacting with the recommendation systems can recognize what I'm talking about there. And what I think goes missing from that conversation is it's not just a function of the recommendation systems, it's a function of the brain that so here's an example. There's a really fascinating researcher at Yale named Yarrow Dunham who does this incredible research on how basically the shortcuts that our brains take, the assumptions they very, very quickly make because our brains just want to shortcut everything and want to offload our decision making wherever possible. And so he brings kids into his lab and he has them randomly choose whether they're going to be in orange t-shirts or green t-shirts. And then he shows them these ambiguous scenes starring a mishmash of kids in orange and green t-shirts. And those ambiguous scenes would involve something like a kid in tears on the ground in front of an empty swing with another kid behind him who clearly at one point was involved in pushing him on the swing. But depending on which shirt the kid viewing the scene is in, and depending on what shirt the two kids in the scene are wearing, the interpretation is wildly different. And so when they line up with what you're wearing, then these kids will say, well, that kid pushed the other kid out of the swing. And when it's a different combination of colors, they'll say, "Oh, that poor kid fell out of the swing, and that nice kid behind them is going to help them up in a moment." And what his research shows is that not only do these kids make wild assumptions about one another based on nothing more than the t-shirt, but over time, their brains begin to compile this totally random thing as if it's evidence until they start to make assumptions that, oh, kids in orange shirts are mean, kids in green shirts are nice, right? That system that we have for making that kind of decision is the kind of system that also lets us instinctively run away from snakes, right? And not eat diseased food and not trust enemy tribesmen. And it does all these things that kept us alive for, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years. But what it does in the modern landscape is make us really easy to manipulate. And what I think is what I'm worried about with this AI revolution we're in is, I don't think I mean, once upon a time, I would have said no one is, openly trying to manipulate you. But now I'm in a world where Elon Musk lives, and I'm like, oh well, some people actually are trying to manipulate your opinions about stuff. But I think inadvertently, even if only inadvertently, you've got these companies that are building these systems that our brains cannot help but trust, cannot help but rely on, and that we're going to more and more deeply embed into our lives as our bosses require it, as as peer pressure requires it. And my long-term worry here is that we really are going to stop being able to do some of the really fundamental, awkward, difficult tasks of being humans together because these systems are going to make it seem like we don't have to do that anymore.
Let's delve more into that. I wanted to ask you, what do you think is potentially going to be lost in this age of, I guess, algorithmic decision making and AI that maybe people haven't realized we could be losing?
Well, already we're seeing signs of a certain kind of loss. So I was talking to a literature professor at UC Berkeley who was saying to me that one of his most difficult problems he faces right now, he teaches a class in reading literature deeply. And they read, I think, only like two or three books in the entire class. And he says that he has to spend like weeks in the beginning of this class convincing incoming freshmen that there is a big and important difference between having read the book and having read a summary of the book provided by ChatGPT. He literally, there were kids that he says he gets to the end of the class and he still hasn't gotten through to them on the idea that there's a difference there. So right there, you're dealing with people coming to believe that an automated summary of a thing is as good as the real thing, right? Is that. My 12-year-old daughter was just saying the other day, she was like, I wish I could make the art as well as ChatGPT does, but I also like to make the art. And so I'm angry at it for making me feel that way, was kind of her thing. She's a very insightful kid, and I'm always sort of using her as my guru. I'm always asking her what she thinks about things so that I know how I feel about them. But in this case, she's pointing out this fundamental thing that's happening where people are just sort of saying, well, I don't need to have to write my own wedding vows. This thing will do it for me, right? It's because our systems are just built to hand off wherever possible. And so I feel like that stuff is getting lost. What I think is going to eventually get built into this is, where I think this is going, is going to go is there's the individual loss, like a loss of focus, a loss of ability to sit and engage with a piece of literature, like there's some of that stuff. But on an institutional level, you're also, I think, going to enter a world in which people no longer want to be held responsible for systemic decisions, because this is another thing that we're seeing, right? Is that in the book, I interviewed a bunch of folks who deal in the ways in which some big life and death decisions are being made by automated systems. And when you want to appeal those decisions because a mistake has been made, no one has any idea how to do that. So there's a University of Baltimore law clinic that tries to specifically deal with people who've been denied their benefits, their SNAP benefits, their welfare benefits. And as often as not, they say they wind up in front of an administrative judge in court, and they've discovered that some off-the-shelf piece of pattern recognition software has been used, and nobody in the room can explain how it made the decision, including the people who've built it. And yet, the agencies who are overworked and understaffed and under-resourced are only too happy to accept the idea that this system can make the choice for them. And so it creates this, not just the sort of psychological pressure that we suffer from in thinking, well, we don't need to do this anymore, but there's an institutional sort of market pressure that I think is also going to create this idea that, like, we're not going to need people in that job anymore. We're going to not need a way to review it on a human level anymore, because this thing will take care of it for us. And I think as those categories of choices become even more kind of morally difficult, that's where we're going to be most tempted to hand this stuff over. Human beings hate making decisions, moral decisions. And so wherever the computer can tell you what to do, we love that on a psychological level. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm worried about in terms of erosion here.
Would you be able to, like, I know this is kind of theoretical, but like, what would be an example of how this could get really bad from an institutional lens when it comes to moral decision making? What's something that you really worry about in the future that's concrete for my listeners?
Yeah. So, well, I think about, we're already feeling it in things like job applications where the automated decision-making systems, these ADS systems, are already, the first line of filtration in any, in any conversation about a job. And we're seeing, and there are patterns that emerge in that nobody in the hiring role even knows how to interrogate, right? You don't know, like, no one's taking the time to say, wait, is this thing really working? I've talked, for instance, to a healthcare system that had adopted a big automated decision system for doing triage on cardiac patients. Basically, you had these cardiologists come in at the beginning of their shift, and rather than them looking through the chart and figuring out which of the patients they should look at first, this automated system looks at everybody's vitals and says, you should see this guy first and this guy second, because this is the order in which this stuff is going to happen. This is the order of danger for these patients. And the effect has been pretty positive, right? This is the thing that I bump into a lot, is that this stuff does often work, maybe not perfectly, but it does often work. And in this case, the rate of cardiac events has gone down and people are really excited about that. Okay, great. I'm glad. Short term, upside, fantastic. Well, I asked these people, well, so how often are these doctors, these cardiologists, interrogating the system, saying, "Are we sure it's this guy?" And they said, "Oh, almost never. We had one guy ask once, like how the system makes its choices. Otherwise, they're only too happy to let it happen." And on the one hand, that in the short term, with physicians who have all of the modern human training in the body and how it functions, is pretty good. I would argue that in a couple of medical school classes, when newly appointed, when residents are suddenly and interns are suddenly growing up with the expectation they don't need to be able to read the chart fully, that the system will tell them, I just think there's a de-skilling that starts to happen there. I mean, another place we're seeing this right now, and this is a huge issue, I think, it's the one I'm really focused on at the moment, is young people, like 1 in 5 kids, according to a recent study, are treating chatbots as friends and, in some cases, intimate partners, using them to feel romantic feelings for the first time. You talk about a generation of people who are going to have no idea how to really be in a real relationship with somebody because they've had this incredibly sycophantic, hypersexual, always-on experience with this perfectly tailored product. There's some real reprogramming going on there. Now, I want to say here, I know I'm super dark on this topic once you get me rolling. I think there are tremendous uses for this stuff, wonderfully positive uses for this stuff. And I don't think the technology is inherently bad. It is, in my experience as a technology correspondent, always the incentive structure that gets us into trouble. It's the place where people try to make money off this stuff that gets us into trouble. But I do think there can be wonderful uses for this. So I'm not a total bummer on this topic. I just am worried about the way that this entirely for-profit industry winds up sort of in the driver's seat of this stuff, as opposed to it coming out of an academic setting or out of even a defense setting. So that's one caveat I'll just throw at you there.
Do you want to maybe, I should have asked this earlier, to be honest, just for the sake of my listeners, but I always like to get into the title, the loop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
What does that mean, and what's the structure of this loop that we're talking about?
Yeah, so the loop is me gesturing at the idea that we're going to get stuck, if we're not careful, in a shrinking cycle of choices, a downward spiral of diminished choice. And it's going to feel like we're getting more choice because it's going to be convenient and in some ways pretty satisfying, but that it's going to look like an expanding orbit when in fact it's going to be a shrinking orbit. And already we're seeing signs of this. It sort of sucks because you think in writing a book like this that you want to be right, but I have been really upset to discover to see things that I worried about 6 or 7 years ago, like sort of playing out now in real life. So there's this big conference that's going on. You and I are speaking on Friday, December 5th. There's a big conference that ends today called NeurIPS. It's the big sort of pseudo-academic conference where a lot of big cutting-edge AI stuff gets announced. And you'll have researchers from companies and researchers from academia coming together to compare notes. And a big study came out that won a top award at this year's NeurIPS conference. And it's a consortium of people from Stanford, the University of Washington, Carnegie Mellon, a bunch of other places. And what it found was it warned about something called artificial hive mind. And what it basically
I
found
wanted to
is that-
ask about that. You just
Oh,
covered that
man.
on YouTube.
Yeah, so I did. It's so interesting, and it is so alarming because it really is my loop thesis playing out. So what they did is they created a corpus of tens of thousands of open-ended prompts from the real world. People coming to a ChatGPT program and asking things like, what should I say in this wedding speech? These sort of open-ended creative requests. And what they did was they put those prompts in front of 70 different large language models, this incredibly wide range of all the majors that you've heard of and all of these sort of obscure ones that are less commonly known. And they found two really frightening things that were going on. One was what they called intra-model collapse, I think they called it, and then inter-model collapse. And what they basically found was individual large language models would begin over time to smash the range of answers into a narrower and narrower band. So rather than you getting the wide range of weird responses that you would hope you would get from a bunch of human brainstorm collaborators, you're getting a narrower and narrower chunk. What they also found, however, and this is the crazy part, and this was even more pronounced in their study, is that the different LLMs would converge over time on the same answers. So it's literally that shrinking spiral, that downward spiral of diminishing choice. It is the feeling, you might be somebody saying, well, today I'm going to mix it up and go to Gemini or Google's equivalent to ChatGPT or, Llama, Facebook's version. And instead, and you think you're doing that for a variety of opinions. And what's actually happening is you're just getting more of the same because these systems are all converging on a narrow middle ground. And this is my worry, right? Is that we're going to think we are shopping for other perspectives and getting other perspectives when in fact we're getting a narrower and narrower band of perspectives because what these systems do is just sample and regurgitate. And so to my mind, so that's sort of the loop concept, is that we'll get stuck in, whether institutionally or individually or socially, we're going to get stuck in the illusion that we are doing better using these tools when in fact we're going to be doing some really fundamental damage to really important stuff about us.
I want to go back to what you said about children and using AI, but before we do that, could we get into what do you think the biggest misunderstanding people have about AI is? Or where do you think people have gone off the rails maybe with certain concerns? Because like I said at the opening, I think there's times where we get concerned about the more sensationalistic stuff and we don't get concerned about maybe the more worrisome aspects that are hitting us right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, I will first of all say that I will bring up all kinds of worries that make me no fun at parties in this conversation. But one of my worries is not the Terminator scenario. I'm not worried about Skynet. I'm worried about Idiocracy, that Mike Judge movie, right? That's the movie. I'm worried about Wall-E, right? And it is, what the technical people all tell me is that they don't believe that the architecture of what's currently being built is even putting us on a path toward what the AI people called AGI, artificial general intelligence, this imaginary sort of super intelligence that's going to be more capable than humans. There's a guy named Ilya Sutskever who was one of the founders of OpenAI, and he recently gave a big talk basically saying, we're not on the path to that. That's not happening, basically. He said, we're more than 10 years away from being anywhere near something like that. So I'm not concerned about that part of it. I've lost track of your question, though. Sorry. Remind me.
The misunderstandings that people have about AI, because
it's the end of a Friday, and I'm totally.
No, I get you.
So,
but I feel like sometimes people, the way they talk about AI is very strange because you're not, when you're chatting with ChatGPT, you're not actually chatting with it. It's guessing words. It's not thinking. And I don't know how to explain that to people half the time.
That's right. Well, so I've been trying to sort of broadcast this term that I use a lot called AI distortion. That because I was calling it AI psychosis, but I find that people don't like to associate themselves with the notion of psychosis. And I would just point out, like, I fall prey to all this stuff that I study because I'm, if anything, the most vulnerable to this stuff because I'm so quick to anthropomorphize everything. But so AI distortion, I'm using as this term for just the general confusion that takes hold of us when we are dealing with these systems. It is, you know, back in the 1960s, there was a famous case where a guy named Joseph Weizenbaum, who was an early computer science researcher, created a chat bot, like an early version of a chat bot that would basically just kind of mirror your responses back to you and fake it in this way that was really, it turned out, compelling. He dressed it up as a therapist. He told people, "This is a robot therapist. Why don't you sit with it for a moment?" He put his secretary in front of it first. This is like 1967, something like that, at MIT. And his secretary, within 5 minutes, turns around and says to him, "I need you to leave the room because I'm going to be divulging some really personal. This is a personal conversation. I can't have you listening to it." People within a couple of years were predicting the end of human therapy. The American Psychological Association was saying it was going to go out of business. Like, I mean, people were absolutely panicked about this because people are so quick to assume that this incredibly idiotic teletype system that literally you type in, "I'm so upset at my husband," and it writes back, "You're upset at your husband." And from there, you just bare your soul. Joseph Weizenbaum quit the field. He was so upset by what he discovered. He wrote a whole book about how computers basically prey on humans if we're not careful because we are so gullible. And so today, it's not even, we are just so prone to believing that these systems have a soul and know us and are thinking it through. And it doesn't help that all the companies making this stuff keep slapping these marketing terms on them like reasoning. They call it a reasoning model, or they'll say it's thinking. It's not thinking, it's what it's doing is running the math on the words you've used and making a statistical guess as to what the most logical next words might be, with an occasional poke from a piece of software saying, "Make sure you say his name again," or "Remember, he likes to talk about this thing." Put this topic back in every so often. And so it looks to us like a friend, a companion, the perfect intern, someone who knows us and remembers us. But it's not. It's literally just an incredibly sophisticated parrot that knows how to mimic the sounds of your language without really understanding the language. And so that is, to me, the really powerful and important piece of distortion that we're all in the grip of right now. And we haven't even gotten to the world yet where we're going to be talking to these things all the time rather than typing at them, or where they're going to show up looking like our dead grandmother and trying to sell us snow tires. Like, we haven't entered that world yet. And so even at this really primitive stage, people are already thinking this thing are their guru or their friend or their lover, because it just, again, it plays on a really fundamental piece of ancient circuitry.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to get into more because you mentioned that term AI psychosis, and I was thinking when we were talking about children and how they use AI. There was an incident a few years back. I don't know if you recall it. This teenage boy, Suel Garcia, I think, that was using the character AI app. And he
Right.
believed that he had fallen in love with the chatbot, which was modeled after the Game of Thrones character Daenerys. And he eventually became so isolated that he self-harmed.
Yeah.
And Megan Garcia, I think, is suing. Now, I'm not one of those people that I don't like to be a moral panic type. Like
Hmm.
I think it's horrible when, the parents are like, "Oh, my kid's being corrupted by heavy metal music or Dungeons and
Right.
Dragons."
Yeah,
But I,
totally.
I do worry about when I hear incidents like the case of Swell Garcia, how is this AI affecting our youth? And,
Yeah.
can it lead to a sort of psychosis where you think you're in a relationship with an AI?
I mean, what we know already is that it absolutely can, right? We not only do we know that from cases like Suel Garcia, and there are long lists of, the OpenAI alone is facing a bunch of lawsuits from families of people who either wound up in really serious psychological crisis or in some cases taking their own lives. And some of these people are people with no diagnosed history of mental illness in the past. So, and OpenAI, as of about a month ago, has put out numbers that show that of the 800 million, I mean, this is the thing, is like they put out the percentages, they don't put out the absolute numbers. So that's like, so they say 0.15% of our weekly users are exhibiting signs of suicidal intent. And so we take that very seriously, and we're doing this and we're doing that. Well, 0.15% of 800 million weekly users is more than a million weekly people each week openly discussing suicide on these platforms, right? So on the one hand, you could say, well, this is just a reflection of the way the world is, and with a platform that big, you can't, be responsible for everything. This is the argument that the social media companies made for years and years, is like, we're just a reflection of society, and so we can't be responsible for society's ills. But the problem with that argument, I would say, is that at the same time, you have these companies openly talking about trying to create a connection, an emotional connection with the product. And, every company wants to do that in theory, right? Coca-Cola sells happiness, and Nike sells ambition, and
It
Dove
doesn't,
sells.
not to
Right.
interrupt you, but doesn't this
Yeah.
get into OpenAI's recent Code Red memo?
So that's right. So this week, this is what I was going to mention, is that this week, OpenAI announced basically its workers came back from the Thanksgiving break and suddenly were hit with this memo that said, Code Red, we have to get back to making this product better, the fundamental product better. And one of the ways in which they want to make it better, according to the head of ChatGPT, this guy, Nick Turley, he said, we want it to be personal and intuitive. Intuitive and personal, I think were his exact words. And it is the personalization of the product that is part of what has made it so successful. There was this version of ChatGPT that came out last year that was the 4.0 version, it's called. And it was very sycophantic. It was always saying, great job, and you're the best, and way to go. And it also, according to a big report out of the New York Times, produced an uptick in reports of real mental crises in people. So then OpenAI rolls that back and replaces it with this new 5.0 version. And the 5.0 version is much more robotic, much less sycophantic. And everybody, like not everybody, but tons of people complain. They are outraged that they can't have the sycophantic 4.0 version anymore. And so Sam Altman writes, don't worry, everybody, we're going to bring it back. Paying subscribers can have it. And so there's really this isn't an academic product. This is a product. This is a moneymaker. And so these companies are not given to, they're not going to make a system that says, hey, you shouldn't trust me, I'm just a robot. They're going to make a system that says, great job, great to see you. How else can I be helpful? Which is why you also have, I write a column for a Substack called Hard Reset. I just wrote one today that articulates the ways in which state laws, because there's no federal law about this, state laws are starting to jump in and actually say, you know what, you're not allowed to make a companion for kids. You're not allowed to make a robot therapist. You're not allowed to, a kid who spends time on this thing has to be reminded every few hours to take a break. There are rules coming along. Usually in the United States, we only care about death and monetary loss. We're starting to make rules now about how people are psychologically and their psychological health, because these systems are going to play on that in a really powerful new way.
This is a hard question because I don't think there's a definitive answer because, we're talking about, there's a lot of gray areas in all of this. But how do we draw the line between, helpful automation or helpful AI and sort of harmful outsourcing of judgment and agency? Because I do think there can be uses for AI. I know I've worked with autistic kids before, and I've seen some research saying that these LLMs could be used for support for autistic people. And I think that would be, a good thing. But
Yep.
it seems like we need to look at the costs and the benefits, and it's hard to draw that line.
I think that's absolutely great. I mean, we are not mature enough as a society to know at this point how this is supposed to work. In the early days of OpenAI, I had a conversation with a couple of researchers there who told me that there was an internal, thought experiment that they called the heroin problem, and it was a theoretical question you're building, they said to me, if we're going to build like a perfect AI assistant for somebody and they're addicted to heroin, what's it supposed to do? Is it supposed to help get you off of heroin, or is it supposed to facilitate your addiction? Because it could do either thing, right? And as a society, we tend to say, oh, people make their own choices. Everyone is is their own steward, everybody's quarterbacking their own lives. But what we know from experience with things like, cigarettes is that's not true. On the other hand, the same kind of addictive principles that make cigarettes an incredible industry also makes it possible for people to get hooked on things like Peloton, right? And one could say that's a positive, right? So to my mind, it isn't the playing on the circuitry that necessarily has to be regulated. But what we also know, I think, is that you can look inside the companies and their incentive structure and map their incentives to the psychological outcomes of their products. And I think that's where you begin to figure out, oh, is money more easily made off people? This is the essence of the gambling industry, right? That industry has figured out that money is way better made off people when you play to their unconscious instincts than when you give them a chance to take a break. And that's why state regulation has had to jump in. 38 states at this point have legalized sports gambling online. Now, almost all of them, I believe, have required that you be allowed to tell the casino or the sports gambling company, leave me alone. And they have to leave you alone from then on. There is an incentive. I think it's not just about the circuitry, it's about the incentives. And so I think there's a way to sort of map that on. There's a very really smart and creative thinker at Duke Law named Nita Farahani, who I am a really big fan of. And she has a book called The Battle for Your Brain. And she talks about the concept of what she calls cognitive liberty, which she has a whole legal framework for, is really saying, there's like an ingredients list. If you're being manipulated and the outcome is negative and this thing is this, and this, if you've satisfied this checklist, then this company is in the wrong. I think we are smart enough as a society to come up with a checklist like that and make it happen. But I think we're going to have to move beyond what we've traditionally been about, which is to assume that everybody's making their own choices and that we only have to protect them against death and, robbery, which is how it's worked in the past in the United States.
You know, I know you probably get this question a lot. What can be done? What
Hmm.
what can we do to sort of fight back?
Yeah,
And I think a lot of people like to focus on the individual when it comes to that. Well, what can
right.
the individual do? What can I, as a single person, do? I'm more interested in what would your advice be to the institutions and
Yeah.
the institutions that build our society and maintain our society?
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that. And I love that you are seeing right through the myth that that we're all supposed to sort of take care of it ourselves, because that is a line that both kind of comports to our desire for a clean and easy narrative. We love that narrative of, the lone Jimmy Stewart fights back. And it also is what the companies are always emphasizing is like, well, individual responsibility or media literacy, or, they love to sort of talk about how it should be the responsibility of human beings to deal with it. So I agree with you completely. I mean, first of all, these companies have hired the smartest experts in persuasion, in the world. They worked at social media companies. Now they're working at the AI companies. And so it is not fair to imagine that you or I are going to like fight back against that individually. I think there are steps one can take. I try to teach my kids and I try to live by the idea that like you should be using these things as tools to actively retrieve what you need. Don't use them to passively deliver either entertainment or a simulacrum of creativity. You got to use it to fuel your creativity. Okay, great. But that's also like saying, as I mentioned, I'm a former drinker. When I see the phrase "drink responsibly," which it always says on the ads, it makes me crazy. I'm like, dude, there's no way I can drink responsibly. That's why I don't drink. So ultimately, I do think that what's going to happen is, one of the great engines of change in the United States for better or for worse, are plaintiffs' lawyers. I think that liability and class action lawsuits are going to be how we sort this stuff out. And people, legal experts will tell you like, well, we don't want to, legislate this one courtroom at a time. Well, I think we're going to have to for a while. And so I think some big bad lawsuits are going to have to come these companies' way, not just for not just for the kind of legal damages that might cause them to change their systems, but also for discovery, right? The legal term for, um, uh, you know, basically the need for looking inside the interstices of these companies and the decisions that they make, the strategies that they have pursued. That's one of the best possible ways to get legislators hip to, oh, here's a bad thing. Oh, I didn't realize, the cigarette companies had a whole playbook for a nicotine delivery system, right? It's discovery that makes all of that possible. And so lawyers have a bad rap, but I really am a big fan in this case of what the ambulance chasers are going to accomplish when they get their teeth into the incentive structure of a company that wants to create the deepest possible emotional bond with the people most prone to forming that bond, which is the history of where a lot of stuff has gone wrong in this case.
Now, your book came out, I believe, in 2022.
Yeah.
It's 2025. Is there anything looking back on it that you would have changed, or what were you surprised by that has happened since then, positive or negative? Uh, Maybe compare and contrast from when you wrote it to what's happening now.
Well, I think what I didn't understand at the time, so I was writing it and doing the research at a time when companies were, for the most part, still in the fad of um, like wanting to be seen as world improving change agents. It was very sort of like cool in the Silicon Valley world to be considered, the folks who made the Arab Spring possible, like all that kind of stuff was the essence of Silicon Valley once upon a time. But now I wasn't prepared for the shift to where we're at now, where these companies are very weirdly not as interested in that kind of, some of these, I mean, some companies like, Elon Musk's company, you know, isn't even really pretending to be about, Twitter is, I mean, X, right, is just turned into like a troll haven. It's not
Well, now
about,
he's trying to create like a almost like I would say it's like a political Wikipedia, the Grokpedia thing. Like
yeah,
he's
yeah.
trying to make his own version that'll combat what he
Yeah.
disagrees with on
Yeah,
Wikipedia.
that's right. That's right. And none of that really comports with what, none of that jives with what the original sort of way that those companies were supposed to be. We're going to connect people and blah, 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 blah. All that has kind of gone away. And even in the companies that do say things like, we're going to help cure cancer, Sam Altman and Dario Amodei, the guy who runs Anthropic, co-founded Anthropic, and, a lot of these founders are all talking about how there's going to be this grand utopia on the far side of things. Um, but in the meantime, they're very happy to say, but we're also there's going to be like 20% unemployment, and we're going to like, wipe out whole categories of jobs. There's going to be enormous short-term disruption. There's an openness about breaking things that is very weird. And, so there's that I didn't anticipate. And I also didn't anticipate how friendly the regulatory regime would become toward them at the federal level, right? I didn't know going into this book that the Trump administration would wind up so friendly with these folks, and what it would be to be in a world where they really don't face any federal regulation or any inclination toward federal regulation at all. So those things I didn't really anticipate, and I don't think I knew how fast this was going to happen, right? The book, I thought I was like 5 years early on this book, and it came out 10 months before ChatGPT did. I didn't recognize how quick this was all going to take place and how quickly people were going to take it into their lives. I thought it was going to be a slower drip than this, and I was wrong.
Before we close out, one of the in some ways I hate it when I get into like casual conversation about AI and these issues that we're talking about related to it, because I will always come across people that just want to, in my view, shut down the conversation
Mm.
by saying, well, you can't fight the future, just embrace it, as if I'm saying, oh, we should just not have any AI. Or they'll say, oh, you're just a Luddite. And I feel like there's a lot of conversation stoppers when it comes to discussing this. What do you make of the way people have tried to shut down conversation or criticism at times? Because I feel like that's a real thing.
Yeah, I think so. There's a wonderful book by a guy named Brian Merchant called Blood in the Machine, and it's a history of the Luddites. And it's so great. It's so smart. I wish I had thought to do this book. It's the curse of being a journalist that you're always hating uh, other great ideas because you didn't come up with them. But Brian Merchant, what he sort of showed in in this history is that the Luddites were not anti-technology, right? We use the term Luddite to say, oh, it's, you're anti-technology, you're anti-progress. No, the Luddites, it turns out, were some of the most technologically sophisticated people in the world at that time. What they were essentially was like coders. They were weavers and had these very sophisticated sort of village systems for taking in piecework and producing incredible cloth and artistry and they were very, very technical. And along come the factory owners and looms, and they begin basically enslaving children and forcing them into factories to work day and night. There's no such thing as a weekend. And what the Luddites did essentially was to say, F that. And they came in and burned these factories down. They were like, they were rebels against not technology, but against profiteering, right? And so when I I think the laziest argument that people make in defense of this stuff is, well, we have to let progress move forward. Or people are always saying to me, well, the toothpaste is out of the tube. And I'm always like, we're great at putting toothpaste into tubes in this country. Like we're good at that. Like we, you and I would be smoking cigarettes in this interview if it weren't for, the ways in which we've put toothpaste in the tube in the past. Football players would be still running around with leather helmets on. We'd be driving around without airbags. Like, I mean, we're good at, we're slow, but we're good at spotting problems and fixing them. And to say that that trying to think this stuff through in advance, and nothing will make. I have to say I've had conversations with people in Silicon Valley where, if I suggest to them that it should be their job to think this stuff through in advance, they go, "Well, that's crazy. I can't do that." And I just think, yeah, you can. We teach kids to do that. You should be able to do that too. And so to my mind, it is a total smokescreen when people say you're an enemy of progress. You got to let it move forward. I think that's the laziest
Well, yeah,
possible
it's
way to think
not
about this.
it's not all or nothing, right? Like
Right.
it's not, oh, we need to like not touch AI in any way and let Silicon Valley work out
That's right.
everything the way it wants to, or ban everything. I mean, there's
That's
a
right.
middle ground.
That's right.
There's always been regulation. We
That's right. And we
Everything in
just
society is negotiated.
That's right. And don't let anybody convince you that this stuff is like the weather, that it's some kind of storm system blowing in that no one has control over. It's made by people and it's adopted by people, and we can change that. We can negotiate that.
Well, on a related note to this, and then I'll let you go. How much? I mean, Do you happen to know how much money and effort goes into the sort of PR campaigns when it comes to AI?
I don't know a dollar figure,
Right, right.
but it is, but the playbook has been really interesting. I'm actually about to have a guest on my podcast, The Rip Current, who's a crisis PR person, because I really want to talk to her about how weird it is to have these companies openly saying we're going to destroy jobs, or openly, in some cases, even saying we run the risk of creating robots that might kill us all. I mean, they literally say that kind of thing. And it's so odd because it's a kind of like it's a combination of both kind of taking ownership of the worst case scenario in a way, like getting out in front of it, but then also it is a function of it's like marketing. It's like saying, look how powerful our product is. It might take over the world someday. And so the old, so that's one part of it. There's also an internal PR thing that happens. That's more like an internal comms thing that was pioneered early in Silicon Valley, and I think is now a big part of the AI world, which is it was to convince people working in these companies that their work is going to make an enormously positive difference in the world. There was a whole administrative layer whose job it was to basically every morning buck everyone up and say, you're making an amazing change in the world. And I'm sure that is still a big part of how these companies function. But now there's a weird, slightly Machiavellian quality to it, where they're also sort of saying like, and I know it's going to be very, very complicated and difficult, but you should plow ahead anyway. So there is, I think, enormous effort put into that kind of stuff.
Well, I know I have to keep going, but how can my listeners get a hold of the book? And what do you hope my listeners get out of this conversation? Thank you again, Jacob Ward.
Oh man, I really appreciate you having me here. So I'm easy to find online. I'm by Jacob Ward, as if it's my byline, by Jacob Ward on all the platforms. I have this podcast, The Rip Current, which comes out more or less every day. And the book is called The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. It's an audiobook. If you like the sound of my voice, I'm the one who recorded it. I think for me, fundamentally, I just do want to keep this idea in the forefront of people's minds that this isn't about worrying about what can go wrong as much as wanting to protect what is good. That's how I think about this stuff. For me, it's not that I'm, I worry about amplifying the bad parts of human psyches and human systemic trouble. But I also am even more concerned about just amplifying the good stuff, protecting the good stuff. There is
preserving
so much
the good stuff.
Yeah, preserving the good stuff, the creative friction and the weird awkwardness of getting to know people. And, that stuff is special and amazing and what sets us apart from all other species on the planet. And so to my mind, I just sort of want to point out that you can engage with this technology without and use it to amplify the best parts of yourself without compromise. Don't compromise on the difficulty of making your own art, that kind of stuff. Keep doing that. And so to my mind, it's about hanging on to that.
A special thanks to my $10 and above tier supporters on Patreon, who make this show possible with their generous donations. Producers' credits shout out to those supporters: Aaron, Jeremy, Matt, Big Bob's Beepers, James, Enoch, David, Sadad, Tristan, Bob, Eva, Miriam, West Bank Robbery Pod, B. Lund, Transnatural Perspectives Podcast, Dan, Nick, Elliot, Fabian, Tom, Arlen, Bo, Spartacus, James, G, Jamie, Will, JC, WV, Sutra, Orc, Catherine, Darko, Nathan, Holland, Dan, Mark, Chase, Olm, Gary, Emilia, Nick, Brace, Michael, and Brian. Please join those listeners in supporting me at the $10 and above tier of my Patreon page, patreon.com/Parallax Views, if you'd like your very own producer's credit on each and every edition of the program.
Until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff. It's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.